My name is Theodore Williams, and I am 72 years old. The day I buried my wife of 48 years, my only son looked me in the eye, called me incompetent, and threw me out of the very home I had built with my own two hands. He and his wife tossed a lifetime of my Beatrice's memories into garbage bags ready for the curb like yesterday's trash. They thought they had it all figured out. They thought they had everything. What they didn't know was that my wife, my brilliant, far-sighted Beatrice, had left behind one final test. A test of character woven into the very fabric of her will, and they had just failed spectacularly. Before I tell you how I watched their world of greed unravel, I'd love to know where you're listening to my story from. Let me know in the comments below, and please press the like button if you believe a person's true worth is measured by their actions, not their inheritance. The funeral was over. The hollow words of condolence and the awkward, half-hearted hugs had all faded away, left behind at the cemetery where I had just laid down half of my soul. 48 years with my Beatrice. This house, the one we had built from blueprints of hope and cemented with a mortar of laughter, now greeted me with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. It was no longer a home. It was just an empty structure, a shell. I stood on the familiar oak porch, my feet heavy. I had crossed this threshold thousands of times. I had carried Andre in my arms as a newborn over this very spot. I had steadied Beatrice here after her knee surgery. I had returned from countless long days as an engineer to be greeted by the warm scent of her baking. This door was a silent witness to our entire life. My hand went to my pocket, the aged, calloused fingers of a retired builder trembling slightly as they searched for my keys. The metallic jingle sounded lonely in the quiet afternoon air. I pulled out the worn brass key, the one Beatrice used to call the soul of the house. I slid it into the lock. It met a dead stop. A dry metallic click echoed in the stillness. It wouldn't turn. I frowned, pulling the key out and staring at it as if it had personally betrayed me. I tried again, more carefully this time, pushing it in as far as it would go. Nothing. Just cold, unmoving metal. I leaned closer, my eyes focusing on the lock itself. It wasn't our lock. The old, slightly scratched brass fixture was gone. In its place was a cylinder of gleaming silver metal, shiny, cold, and utterly alien. A chilling unease began to creep into my chest, a cold more biting than the October wind. Who would do this? Why, there had been no call, no warning. I stood there, a 72-year-old man locked out of his own life. Just then the door swung open. Andre, my son, stood there. He was wearing an expensive cashmere sweater, his face a mask of detached calm. Behind him, framed in the warm yellow light of the hallway, was his wife, Tiffany. She was dressed in a tight black dress, her face arranged into a look of carefully practiced concern. "Dad," Andre said, his voice flat as if he were delivering a quarterly report, "we changed the locks. For your own safety. My safety or theirs." Tiffany glided forward and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. Her hug was stiff and cold. "Dad, we were so worried about you. Come on inside." She guided me in, but the gesture didn't feel welcoming. It felt like a guard escorting a prisoner. My eyes scanned the living room. Everything seemed to be in its place, yet something was profoundly wrong. An unfamiliar emptiness hung in the air. And then I saw them. 3 large black garbage bags knotted at the top, sitting by the door, ready to be cast out. Something familiar peeked through the thin plastic of one of the bags. I walked towards them, my heart beginning to pound a dangerous rhythm against my ribs. I knelt, my old knees cracking in protest, and pulled the top of the bag open. The first thing I saw was the blue wool shawl, the one I'd bought for Beatrice on our first trip to New England. She wore it every winter, and it still carried the faint, comforting scent of her lavender perfume. I could almost hear her voice as she'd pressed it to her cheek, saying, "It feels like a hug from you, Theo." Beneath the shawl was the hardcover novel she had been reading, a bookmark still holding her place at page 142. Next were the small silver picture frames we kept on the mantelpiece. The photo of Andre at his college graduation, the photo of Beatrice and me on our wedding day, our smiles so young and full of foolish, beautiful hope. My son, the man we had poured all our love into, was throwing his own history in the trash. "What is this?" I looked up, my voice hoarse, not with anger, but with a sharp physical pain that shot through my chest. Andre crossed his arms, refusing to even look at the bags. "Just cleaning up a little, Dad. Decluttering. It's not like you'll need this stuff where you're going. Where I'm going. I repeated the words, feeling like shards of glass in my throat. Tiffany placed a hand on Andre's arm, her eyes shining with fake sympathy. Andre, honey, just tell him. Andre took a deep breath as if steeling himself for a difficult presentation. We've found a wonderful place for you, Dad. St. Jude's Senior Living. It's a top-tier facility with 24-hour nursing care. You can't look after yourself anymore, not since Mom passed. I pushed myself to my feet, every joint in my body feeling like it was grinding to dust. I looked directly into my son's eyes. I used to see adoration in those eyes when he was a boy. I saw rebellion in them as a teenager. But now all I saw was a cold, calculating void. You're saying I'm incompetent, I stated. It wasn't a question, it was a diagnosis. This isn't a debate, Dad, Andre replied, a note of impatience creeping into his voice. It's a decision. It's what's best for you. Tiffany quickly interjected, her voice sickly sweet. And we'll manage your finances for you. You won't have to worry about bills or anything anymore. Manage. That was the word they chose. Not help, not assist. Manage. They were stripping me of everything. My home, my memories, my dignity. And they were wrapping their theft in the guise of love. But I didn't scream. I didn't argue. An engineer doesn't waste energy yelling at a failed structure. He steps back, he observes, and he identifies its critical weakness. Beatrice always said my silence was my most formidable weapon. Tonight I would sharpen it. I took one last look at the bags of trash. I looked at my son and my daughter-in-law. They stood there, two strangers in my house, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to cry. I would not give them that satisfaction. I took a slow, deep breath, straightened the lapels of my suit jacket, and turned towards the door. I said nothing. I didn't look back. I just walked, leaving them in a cloud of what I hoped was surprise and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of confusion. As the door clicked shut behind me, the sound of the new cold lock engaging felt like a declaration of war. The game was on, and they had no idea they had already lost. I did not walk aimlessly. Grief can cloud a man's mind, but it does not make him a fool. I did not go to a sterile hotel or burden an old friend with my sudden homelessness. Instead, I took a crosstown bus to a neighborhood my son Andre wouldn't be caught dead in. It wasn't a bad area, just a quiet, working-class part of the city filled with brick buildings and small family-owned shops. The kind of place Andre with his German sedan and Italian suits considered beneath him. I walked to a modest 3-story brownstone and climbed the steps. My hand went to my pocket and retrieved a different key. A single simple key on a plain steel ring. It slid into the lock of apartment 2B with a familiar, satisfying click. The air inside was still and smelled faintly of old books and my Beatrice's lemon furniture polish. It was a small one-bedroom apartment, but it was immaculate. A worn, comfortable armchair sat in the corner next to a floor lamp. A small kitchen, clean and orderly, was visible from the entryway. This was not a place of sorrow. This was a sanctuary. And it was mine. Beatrice and I had bought this place 15 years ago. Andre was in his mid-20s then, already chasing the big money, already talking about how the family home wasn't grand enough for the lifestyle he planned to lead. One evening, Beatrice had turned to me, her eyes holding that familiar mix of wisdom and worry. "Theo," she had said, her voice soft but firm, "you spend your life building bridges strong enough to outlast a hurricane. I think our family needs a small bridge too, a place just for us." It wasn't just a financial investment. She called it our escape pod. If the world gets too loud, she'd explain, or if the house starts to feel less like our home and more like a hotel for other people's ambitions, we'll have our little place. Just Theo and B. I had smiled at the time, thinking it was just my wife's charming sentimentality. But now, sitting in the worn armchair that perfectly molded to the shape of my back, I understood. She wasn't being sentimental. She was being a strategist. She had seen the cracks forming in our family's foundation long before I did. She had seen the subtle shift in our son's eyes from love to entitlement. The main house, the one I'd just been exiled from, we had built that for our family, for our son. It was large and impressive, a symbol of success meant to be passed down. But this apartment, this was the place we had secured for ourselves. It was a testament not to our wealth, but to our partnership. I walked over to the closet and opened it. Inside were a few changes of my clothes neatly hung. In a drawer I found a sealed envelope with a few $1,000s in cash. Another of Beatrice's just-in-case plans. Everything was here, everything I needed. A wave of profound sadness washed over me, a fresh pang of missing her so sharp it took my breath away. I missed her wisdom, I missed her foresight. But as the grief crested, it left something else in its wake, a cold, hard resolve. They had not made me a homeless old man. They had not cast me out into the cold. They had unknowingly forced me into my fortress, a base of operations that my brilliant wife had helped me prepare years in advance. I stood in the quiet warmth of our secret place and felt the weight of the last few hours begin to lift, replaced by the familiar focus of an engineer with a problem to solve. They thought they were playing checkers. They had no idea I was about to play chess. I let the quiet of the apartment settle around me for a few minutes, allowing the turmoil in my mind to calm into a single focused point. Emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. What I needed was information and a strategy. I pulled out my old flip phone, a device Andre always made fun of, and scrolled through the contacts until I found the name I was looking for, Evelyn Reed. She had been our lawyer for over 20 years, but she was more than that. She was Beatrice's closest friend, one of the few people in the world who understood the depth of my wife's intelligence. The phone rang only once before she picked up. Her voice was as calm and steady as I remembered. Evelyn Reed. I didn't need to waste time with pleasantries. Evelyn, it's Theo. I said, my voice quiet. It's happened. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, not of surprise, but of profound, weary sadness. I've been waiting for your call, Theo, she said softly. I am so sorry it had to come to this. Beatrice. She made sure you would be prepared. A shiver went down my spine, but it wasn't from fear. It was a jolt of confirmation. Beatrice had known. She had planned for this. What do I do, Evelyn? I asked. For now, she said, her voice shifting from a friend's comfort to a lawyer's command, you do nothing. You stay where you are. You don't contact them. We will meet tomorrow at my office, 10 o'clock. Just be ready, Theo. The line went dead. I didn't need any more than that. The message was clear. A plan was already in motion. I placed the phone down and walked over to a small desk in the corner where my old laptop sat waiting. It was time for my part. It was time to gather the facts. As an engineer, I believe in data. Feelings can lie, memories can fade, but numbers tell a story that is hard to refute. I powered on the machine and connected to the internet. My fingers steady now typed in the web address for our bank. I entered the username and password for the main joint account I shared with Beatrice, an account our son Andre had been added to 5 years ago for emergency purposes. The page loaded, displaying our life savings in stark black and white. It was a healthy sum, the result of a lifetime of careful work and prudent saving. My eyes scanned the list of recent transactions. The florist for the funeral, a payment to the caterer. Then I saw it. A line item that made the breath catch in my throat. The date was yesterday, the day after I had buried my wife. The transaction was a wire transfer. The amount was $50,000. The recipient was Andre Williams. But it was the memo line, the small note he had typed in to explain the transaction, that felt like a physical blow. It read, for Dad's ongoing healthcare costs. Healthcare costs. I hadn't seen a doctor in over a year. I was in perfect health. This wasn't for my care. This was theft, plain and simple, wrapped in a disgusting lie. He had wasted no time. The grief, the funeral, it was all just a distraction, a cover for him to make his move. I leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under my weight. I remembered a conversation from just 6 months ago. Andre had been complaining about his car, wanting to upgrade to a newer, more luxurious model. He'd hinted at needing a loan, talking about a tight spot with his finances. I had told him then, perhaps a bit too sternly, about the importance of living within his means, a lesson Beatrice and I had tried to instill in him since he was a child. He had just nodded, a flicker of resentment in his eyes that I had foolishly dismissed. Now I saw it clearly. He wasn't just stealing from his grieving father. In his mind, he was taking what he felt he was entitled to. He was cashing in his inheritance before the body of his mother was even cold in the ground. I stared at the screen, at the irrefutable, damning evidence of his betrayal. The sadness I felt began to harden, crystallizing into something cold, sharp, and clear. This wasn't just about a house anymore, this was about justice. And I now held the first piece of evidence in my hand. The $50,000 question wasn't just where the money had gone, it was what the money had been for. The memo line, for Dad's ongoing healthcare costs, was the lie Andre would tell a court. My job was to prove it was a lie before we ever stepped foot in one. As an engineer, I know you don't solve a problem by looking at where you are. You solve it by tracing it back to its origin and then following its path forward. The money had moved from our joint account to Andre's personal one. I couldn't follow it there directly. But I didn't need to. I knew my son, or rather I knew my daughter-in-law. Tiffany lived her life through a screen curating a perfect image of success for an audience of strangers. Her ambition was her weakness, and I was about to exploit it. I opened a new tab in my web browser and typed her name into the search bar of a popular social media site. Her profile was public, a glittering monument to materialism. I scrolled through the posts past photos of expensive dinners and designer handbags, and then I found it. The post was from yesterday, just 2 days after my wife's funeral. It was a picture of Andre and Tiffany grinning ear to ear standing in front of a brand new, obscenely large black SUV. The kind of car that costs more than the first house Beatrice and I ever bought. Tiffany was holding the keys like a trophy, her arm looped through Andre's. He had a champagne flute in his other hand. The caption below the picture read, "Hard work pays off, finally got Andre into a proper family car, had upgraded, had blessed." Hard work. The phrase tasted like ash in my mouth. I did a quick search for the vehicle's sticker price, just as I suspected. The typical down payment was almost exactly $50,000. The lie was already beginning to unravel. I remembered teaching Andre how to drive in our old beat-up station wagon. He was 16, a bundle of nerves and excitement. I sat in the passenger seat, my hand hovering over the emergency brake, my heart caught somewhere between terror and immense pride. We spent hours in empty parking lots practicing three-point turns and parallel parking. His first car was a 10-year-old sedan I bought for $1,000. We spent a whole month of weekends in the garage together, changing the oil, replacing the spark plugs, fixing the brakes. I wasn't just teaching him about cars, I was trying to teach him about value, about the satisfaction that comes from earning something from caring for it with your own two hands. He had learned the lesson for a time, but looking at that picture, at the smug, easy smile on his face, I realized that lesson had long been forgotten, replaced by a much simpler one. Take what you want. I kept scrolling. The evidence was rarely in one place. A few posts further down, I found another gem. It was a screenshot of a booking confirmation. Tiffany had clumsily blacked out the confirmation number, but she'd left everything else visible. First-class tickets to the Bahamas, a 7-night stay at an all-inclusive 5-star resort. The dates were for next week. My son and his wife were planning to grieve for Beatrice on a white sand beach, sipping cocktails paid for with money stolen under the pretense of my failing health. That single image hit me harder than the car. It wasn't just greed. It was a profound, staggering disrespect for his mother's memory. A wave of memories flooded me so vivid it felt like I was drowning. I remembered all the vacations Beatrice and I didn't take. I remembered the year Andre was accepted into that prestigious out-of-state university. We were so proud, but the tuition was astronomical. That same year was our 20th wedding anniversary, and we had been saving for years to take a trip to Italy. I remembered the night we sat at our kitchen table, the travel brochures spread out before us. Beatrice had looked at the pictures of Rome, then she had looked at Andre's acceptance letter. She slid the brochures to one side. "The Colosseum has been standing for 2,000 years, Theo," she'd said. "It can wait. Andre's future can't." We never did get to Italy. We poured every spare dollar into that degree. We took on extra work, drove our old cars until they rusted, and never regretted it for a second. We thought we were investing in our son's life and his character. We were giving him the foundation we never had. But we were wrong. We weren't building his foundation. We were just funding his appetites. He hadn't seen our sacrifice as a gift. He had seen it as his due. I closed the laptop, the faint hum of the machine seeming loud in the silence. The shock had passed. The hurt was still there, a dull, heavy ache deep in my bones. But a new feeling was now layered over it. A cold, clear certainty. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a lapse in judgment brought on by grief. This was a calculated plan, likely years in the making. Andre hadn't just changed. He had been replaced by a stranger who wore his face. A stranger who saw his own father not as family, but as a final asset to be liquidated. I sat there in the quiet apartment, the sanctuary Beatrice had left for me, and I understood my task. I wasn't fighting to get my house back. I was fighting to defend the meaning of the life Beatrice and I had built together. A life of integrity, sacrifice, and love. Values my son had traded away for a shiny new car and a week in the sun. And I would prove with the same methodical precision I used to build bridges that their world was built on a foundation of lies. And I was about to pull out the cornerstone. After documenting the proof of Andre's financial treachery, a profound sense of isolation settled over me. He wasn't just my son. In my mind, he had been my legacy. Now that legacy felt like a ruin. In a moment like this, a man takes stock of what he has left. My thoughts turned from my son to my niece Simone. She was the daughter of Beatrice's younger sister who had passed away far too young. Beatrice and I had stepped in helping Simone through nursing school, making sure she always had a place at our holiday table. She had her mother's kindness and a core of strength that Beatrice had always admired. Unlike Andre, who saw family as a resource, Simone saw it as a responsibility. I knew I needed to call her not to ask for help, but to see if Andre's poison had spread. I found her number and dialed, my heart heavy with the possibility that she too might have been turned against me. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Uncle Theo." "Simone, sweetheart, it's me," I said, keeping my voice as steady and gentle as I could. "I was just calling to see how you were doing. It was a difficult week for all of us." There was a pause and then a rush of words. "Uncle Theo." "Oh, I'm so glad you called. I'm okay, but I've been so worried about you." Her genuine concern was a balm on a wound I didn't realize was so raw. "Worried about me? I'm an old tough bird. You know that," I said, trying for a bit of levity. She hesitated, and I could hear the internal debate in her silence. "It's just, well, something strange happened. Andre called me yesterday." A cold stillness came over me. Here it was, the next move in his campaign. "Oh," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "What did your cousin have to say?" He said you weren't yourself, Uncle Theo," she began, her voice filled with an awkward discomfort. "He said that you were very confused after Aunt Bee's passing and that you might start saying some odd things. He told me that if you called, I should just humor you." I closed my eyes, picturing my son, my own flesh and blood, systematically trying to discredit me, to paint me as a senile old fool to the very people who knew me best. It was a move of breathtaking cruelty. Simone continued, her voice gaining a note of indignation. "And then he said that he and Tiffany were managing your care now, and that if you did call me, I should let him know right away what you said. It felt wrong, Uncle Theo. It felt like he was telling me to spy on you. He sounded so condescending, like he was talking about a child, not his own father." I remained silent, letting her speak. Andre had made a critical error. He assumed Simone's loyalty could be manipulated. He had underestimated her intelligence just as he had underestimated mine. He didn't realize that the love and respect Beatrice and I had shown her over the years had built a bond far stronger than his shallow attempts at control. "Simone," I finally said, my voice low and serious, "did he by any chance mention where I was staying?" "Yes," she said quickly. "He told me he had found a lovely room for you at St. Jude's. He made it sound like a 5-star hotel." The web of lies was intricate. He had a story for everyone, perfectly tailored to make him look like the dutiful son. "Thank you for telling me this, sweetheart," I said, a wave of gratitude washing over me. "It is very, very helpful information. You did the right thing by trusting your gut." I could feel her relief through the phone. "I knew something wasn't right," she whispered. "Are you okay, Uncle Theo? Really?" "I am now, my dear," I said, and for the first time in days, it felt true. I am now. We ended the call, and I sat in the quiet apartment, the battlefield suddenly looking very different. Andre thought he was isolating me, cutting me off from anyone who might help. Instead, he had revealed his entire strategy, and in doing so had given me my first and most important ally. I was no longer a man fighting alone. I was one end of a bridge, and Simone was the other. and together we were strong enough to withstand any storm he could throw at us. A week passed in the quiet solitude of the apartment. I established a routine, a small anchor in the storm of my life. I would wake early, make coffee, and read. I spent hours simply thinking, replaying the events in my mind, not with panic, but with the cool detachment of an engineer examining a structural failure. I was gathering my strength, waiting for my son's next move. I knew it was coming. Andre was not the type to leave things to chance. On Tuesday morning it arrived. A sharp, official-sounding knock echoed through the small apartment. I opened the door to a young man in a cheap suit holding a clipboard and a large manila envelope. He asked if I was Theodore Williams. I said yes, and he handed me the envelope. "You've been served," he said with all the emotion of a cashier telling you your total, then turned and walked away. I closed the door, my hand surprisingly steady as I held the package. It felt heavy, not just in weight, but in meaning. I sat down in my armchair and tore it open. The document inside was thick, filled with dense legal jargon, but the title at the top was brutally clear: Petition for Conservatorship. I read my son's name listed as the petitioner and my name as the respondent. Respondent. A cold, clinical word for a father being sued by his own child. The petition was a work of fiction. It claimed I was a danger to myself, citing my erratic behavior and cognitive decline since Beatrice's passing. It listed my supposed failings, forgetting to pay bills I had never missed, making unstable financial decisions, and suffering from bouts of confusion. Each word was a carefully placed stone intended to build a wall around me and declare me unfit a prisoner in my own life. I thought of all the documents I had signed for Andre over the years: the permission slip for his first school field trip, the cosign on his first car loan, the countless birthday cards always ending with "Love, Dad," and to see his name now on this document, this weapon designed to strip me of my autonomy, felt like the final, most profound betrayal. This was worse than changing the locks. This was an attempt to erase my very identity, to reduce 40 years of responsible fatherhood to a caricature of a helpless old man. The next morning I was sitting in Evelyn Reed's office. It was a calm, orderly space overlooking the city from the 12th floor. The walls were lined with law books, but on her desk, beside a stack of files, was a silver-framed photo of her and Beatrice laughing together on a sailboat. It was a small reminder of the real reason I was here. I had brought the petition with me, and she had it spread out on her desk. "It's a textbook move, Theo," she said, her voice sharp and focused. "He's painting you as a confused, grieving widower who can't be trusted with his own checkbook. Tiffany will get on the stand and cry, talking about how worried they are. They will try to make this about your health, about their concern. They will make it about anything but what it's really about: money." My first instinct, my gut reaction, was to fight back with everything I had. "We can prove they're lying, Evelyn," I said, leaning forward. "I have the bank records. $50,000. I know they bought a car, a vacation to the Bahamas. We can expose them." Evelyn held up a hand, calm and steady. "No, Theo. We don't. Not yet." I stared at her, confused. "Why not?" "It's the truth. Because right now," she explained, her eyes locking onto mine, "it's your word against theirs. It becomes a messy family squabble about money. But a liar, Theo, when given enough rope in a courtroom, will always hang himself. We are going to give Andre and Tiffany all the rope they could possibly want." She leaned back in her chair, her strategy unfolding. "At the hearing, you are not going to be angry. You are not going to be defensive. You are going to be exactly what they claim you are, minus the incompetence. You will be a quiet, dignified man mourning his wife. When their lawyer questions you, you will answer his questions simply and honestly. You will not mention the $50,000. You will not mention the car or the vacation. And under no circumstances will you mention anything about Beatrice's will." I must have looked shocked because she smiled faintly. "The will is our ace, Theo. You never ever play your ace until the final hand is dealt. Right now, we let them build their case. We let them lie to a judge under oath. Every falsehood they tell becomes a permanent part of the legal record. They are building their own trap brick by brick. Our job is simply to let them." I left her office an hour later, the city seeming brighter than when I had arrived. The sting of the petition was still there, but it was no longer a mortal wound. It was just a piece of paper, a move in a game. I finally understood the rules of engagement. I was not supposed to fight back. I was supposed to endure, to be patient, to let my son's greed and arrogance become the instruments of his own undoing. I had walked in feeling like a defendant. I walked out feeling like a hunter, patiently waiting in a blind of my own making, ready for the prey to walk right into my sights. The courtroom was not what I had expected. There was no polished wood jury box or dramatic gallery. It was a small, sterile hearing room painted a depressing shade of beige. It smelled of stale coffee and bureaucracy. The judge, a woman with tired eyes, looked at the file in front of her with an air of profound boredom. This was just another Tuesday for her, another sad family tearing itself apart. For me, it was the most surreal moment of my life. I sat beside Evelyn, my back straight, my hands resting on my knees. Across the room, Andre and Tiffany sat with their lawyer, a man with a slicked-back haircut and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Andre looked confident. Tiffany looked sorrowful. It was all a performance, and the curtain was about to rise. Tiffany was the first to take the stand. She was a natural actress. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue as she spoke, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "I love Theo." She began, looking at the judge with a pained expression. "I really do, like he's my own father. That's why this is so hard." She went on to describe a man I didn't recognize, a man who was forgetful, confused, a danger to himself. The centerpiece of her testimony was a story about an incident that had never happened. "Last month," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I stopped by the house to bring him some groceries, and I smelled gas. I ran into the kitchen, and there he was, just standing there, staring out the window. He had turned on the stove to boil water for tea, but had forgotten to light the burner. The whole kitchen was filling with gas. If I hadn't gotten there when I did..." She let the sentence hang in the air, her meaning clear. She was the hero. I was the helpless victim who nearly blew up the house. I sat there perfectly still, my face a mask of calm. I didn't object. I didn't gasp. I simply watched her weave her tapestry of lies. My mind, the mind she was trying to prove was failing, was perfectly clear. I remembered that day. She had stopped by, but it was I who was cooking. I was making Beatrice's favorite beef stew, and the house smelled of rosemary and thyme, not natural gas. She had stayed for 10 minutes complaining about her workload and left. The lie was so audacious, so complete, that it was almost impressive. She was counting on the fact that it was her word against that of a grieving old man she was painting as senile. Next, it was Andre's turn. He took a different approach. He was not emotional. He was the picture of a concerned, responsible son forced to make a difficult but necessary decision. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, using financial jargon to lend weight to his claims. He presented documents to the judge. Not the $50,000 withdrawal, of course. He was smarter than that. He presented a credit card statement showing a late payment of $35 from 2 months ago. He presented a summary of my investment portfolio, highlighting a single energy stock I had invested in that had lost $5,000 over the last year. He framed it all as a pattern of decline. "Your Honor," he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity, "this isn't about control. This is about protection. My father worked his entire life to build a comfortable retirement. I can't stand by and watch him lose it all because he's no longer capable of managing it properly. It would be a betrayal of his legacy and a betrayal of my mother's memory." The betrayal of my mother's memory. The hypocrisy was so thick I could taste it. He was using Beatrice as a shield for his greed. Then it was my turn. Andre's lawyer called me to the stand. He circled me like a vulture, his questions designed to trip me up, to make me seem confused or angry. "Mr. Williams," he started, his voice dripping with condescension, "my client has shown that you recently lost $5,000 on a risky energy stock. Is that correct?" I looked at the judge, not at him. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady. "That is correct. I made that investment, and it did not perform as I had hoped." The lawyer smiled, believing he had me. "So you admit to being a bit of a gambler with your life savings, Mr. Williams, making risky bets." This was the moment Evelyn had prepared me for. This was the opening. I took a slow breath. "Counselor," I said, my voice remaining level, "all investments carry risk. Sometimes you're wrong, as I was with that energy stock." I then turned my gaze from the lawyer and settled it directly on my son. Andre shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "But sometimes you're right. You see, I also made what some would call a risky investment back in 2002. I took a significant portion of my savings and put it into a struggling little computer company, a company called Apple. A flicker of recognition, then panic appeared in Andre's eyes. He knew this story. My son Andre thought I was a fool. I continued, my voice still conversational. He told me I was wasting my money on a fad. He urged me to be more conservative. But I held on, and the profits from that one risky bet paid for his entire 4-year education at a prestigious private university. It paid for the degree that hangs on his office wall, the degree that gave him the career he has today. It paid for the very foundation upon which he now stands to question my financial judgment. I turned my attention back to the judge, who was now leaning forward, her expression no longer bored. So yes, sir, I make investments. Some I win, some I lose. But I believe my long-term track record of providing for my family, of turning risk into opportunity for their benefit, speaks for itself. I finished speaking, and silence fell over the room. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused anyone of anything. I had simply provided context. In a few short sentences, I had transformed their narrative. I was no longer an incompetent old man gambling away his savings. I was a prudent, lifelong provider who had made his son's success possible. The lawyer stood there momentarily speechless. Andre's face was a mask of pale, furious humiliation. I had not played their game of lies and hysterics. I had played my own game, the game of truth. And the first cracks in their carefully constructed facade were beginning to show. My statement about the Apple stock hung in the air, shifting the gravity in the small beige room. For a moment, I saw a flicker of doubt in the judge's eyes as she looked from me to my son. She saw the truth, I think, in the same way you can see the shape of a landscape during a brief flash of lightning. But the job of a judge is not always to chase the lightning. It is to follow the map of the law, and the map Andre and his lawyer had drawn was filled with hazards, real or imagined. She cleared her throat, her tired expression returning. "Mr. Williams," she said, her voice formal and distant, "your long history of providing for your family is noted. However, the petition before me raises serious concerns about your current well-being, particularly in the wake of your recent and tragic loss." She continued, her words precise and devastating. "Out of an abundance of caution, and pending a full psychiatric evaluation to be completed within the next 30 days, I am granting a temporary conservatorship." I felt Evelyn's hand gently rest on my forearm, a silent reminder to remain impassive. The judge outlined the terms. Andre would be granted temporary authority over my medical decisions. My financial assets would be temporarily frozen and placed under the management of a court-appointed neutral fiduciary. I would be required to submit to a full competency hearing in 1 month's time. Each word was a nail being hammered into the structure of my freedom. Even though I knew it was part of Evelyn's strategy, hearing a court of law declare you unfit, even temporarily, is a humiliation that cuts to the bone. I had built bridges that spanned rivers. I had managed multi-million-dollar construction projects, and now I was legally barred from writing a check for my own groceries. But as I felt the sting of that shame, my focus was not on the judge. It was on them. I watched my son and daughter-in-law as the ruling was read. They were careful not to celebrate openly. They maintained their masks of somber concern for the judge to see, but I saw what no one else did. I saw the quick, triumphant glance that passed between them. It lasted no more than a second, but it contained a universe of meaning. It was a look of pure, unadulterated victory, a shared smirk that said, "We did it. He's finished." Tiffany's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. Andre gave a single satisfied nod so small it was almost invisible. They thought they had won. They truly believed the game was over. The hearing was adjourned. As we all stood, the performance resumed. Tiffany rushed over to me in the hallway, her face a perfect portrait of sorrow. "Oh, Dad," she cooed, reaching for my hand. "I am so sorry it had to come to this. We just want what's best for you. This is for your own good, you'll see." Her touch was reptilian, her words like honey laced with poison, but it was her eyes that told the real story. They were not filled with sympathy. They were cold, hard, and glittering with success. Andre was even more brazen. He stood a few feet away, deliberately within my earshot, and pulled out his phone. He was not texting. He was making a call. "Yes, hello," he said, his voice loud and authoritative. "My name is Andre Williams. I'm calling in reference to the reservation for my father, Theodore Williams, at St. Jude's Senior Living. I just wanted to confirm that the court has approved the move. Yes, the temporary conservatorship was granted. We should be able to move him in by the end of the week. He was not just making arrangements, he was gloating. He was performing his newfound power a cruel victory lap in the sterile hallway of the courthouse. He wanted me to hear it. He wanted me to know that my life was now subject to his schedule. I looked at this man who shared my name, who carried my blood, and I felt a profound and chilling emptiness. The son I had raised, the boy I had taught to ride a bike and to treat others with respect, was gone. In his place stood a predator celebrating his kill before it was even cold. Evelyn gently steered me away down the hall and toward the elevators. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. They believed they had won the war. They had secured the legal high ground and had the full weight of the system on their side. They saw me as a problem that had been solved, an asset that was now under their management. They were so blinded by their victory, so drunk on their own arrogance that they couldn't see the truth. This wasn't a victory for them. It was a sacrifice for me. A necessary move in a much larger game. They hadn't won. They had just walked deeper into the trap, their every lie, now a permanent part of the record, waiting patiently for the moment when the truth would finally be brought into the light. The 2 days following the court hearing were the longest of my life. I was a man in name only. According to the law, I was a ward of the court, a problem to be managed. Andre called twice a day, his voice a sickening blend of false cheerfulness and authority, asking if I'd taken my medication, reminding me of the upcoming evaluation, treating me like a child. Each call was a small, deliberate twist of the knife. I answered his questions politely, my voice quiet and steady, playing the part of the defeated man they needed me to be. I felt like an actor in a play I hadn't written, waiting for the final act to begin. On the third day, the signal came. My phone rang and it was Evelyn. Her voice was crisp, all business. "Theo," she said, "it's time. I'm sending out the official notices today." I knew what that meant. The next move was hers. Evelyn explained that as the executor of Beatrice's estate, she was legally obligated to convene all named beneficiaries for a formal reading of the will. It wasn't a request. It was a legal summons. I imagined the scene at my old house. I could picture the courier arriving, handing Tiffany a stiff, important-looking envelope. I could see her tearing it open, her perfectly manicured nails ripping the paper, her expression shifting from curiosity to annoyance. I knew them so well I could practically hear the conversation that followed. "Another meeting?" Tiffany would say, tossing the letter onto the granite countertop. "Honestly, can't your mother's old lawyer just email us a PDF? We won in court. It's all coming to you anyway, Andre. This is such a waste of time." Andre, in his boundless arrogance, would have seen it as nothing more than a final piece of paperwork, a box to be checked on his path to total ownership. "It's fine, Tiff," I could hear him saying, his voice laced with the condescending patience he now used with me. "It's just a formality. We have to go. It's probably just some sentimental nonsense Mom put in there, a few words about remembering the good times. We'll go, we'll sit there for an hour, we'll listen to the old woman drone on, sign a few documents, and then it's all officially ours. The house, the accounts, everything. The conservatorship gives us control anyway. This just cleans it all up." He would see Evelyn not as the sharp, formidable woman she was, but as a relic from his mother's past, a harmless functionary just doing her job. He would not see her as a threat. That was his greatest mistake. They were underestimating Evelyn, but more than that, they were underestimating my Beatrice. They saw her will as a simple transactional document, a title transfer. They had no concept of the woman who had written it, the woman who could see the subtle rot of greed in her own son's heart, the woman who had loved him enough to give him one final desperate chance to choose a better path. They would see the meeting as a coronation, the final confirmation of their victory. Their greed would not allow them to ignore it. The allure of having everything signed, sealed, and delivered would be too strong to resist. They would walk into Evelyn Reed's office, puffed up with the pride of their recent courtroom victory, ready to claim their prize. They would see me sitting there quiet and defeated, and it would only feed their self-satisfaction. They would have no idea they were not walking into a lawyer's office to collect an inheritance. They were walking into a theater, one that Beatrice had designed years ago. And the final act, the one where the villains get their just desserts, was about to begin. The trap was set. The bait was taken. All I had to do now was watch. The day of the will reading arrived with a cold gray sky that matched the feeling in my gut. Evelyn had asked me to come to her office an hour early. We sat in her main conference room, a place designed to intimidate. The The room was vast and impersonal, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that felt as cold as a tombstone. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but the glass was so thick it made the world outside seem silent and distant, like a movie with the sound turned off. The leather chairs were high-backed and imposing. Everything about the room was designed to communicate power and money, two things I had once valued but now saw as instruments of corruption. We sat in silence, the air thick with unspoken anticipation. It was the calm before the storm. Right on time, the door opened. Andre and Tiffany swept in, not with the humility of a grieving son, but with the impatient air of executives arriving at a meeting they considered a waste of time. Tiffany was wearing a sharp, cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my first car. Andre was in a dark, tailored suit, looking every bit the Wall Street shark he had become. He gave Evelyn a curt, professional nod. "Evelyn," he said. He glanced at me, his eyes holding no warmth, just a flicker of annoyance. "Dad." They took their seats directly across the table, the polished wood stretching between us like a battlefield. They didn't speak further, simply waiting for the proceedings to begin, for the final formality of their victory to be concluded. Just as Evelyn was about to speak, the conference room door opened again. A young woman stepped inside. It was Simone. She was wearing her simple blue nurse's scrubs, having come directly from her shift at the hospital. Her presence in this cold corporate space was like a splash of color in a black and white film. She looked tired from a long day's work, but her eyes were clear and steady. She ignored Andre and Tiffany completely, her gaze finding mine. She gave me a small, warm smile, a silent message of support that meant the world to me. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted. Andre stiffened, his brow furrowed in confusion. Tiffany's mask of bored indifference cracked, replaced by a look of undisguised hostility. "Simone," Tiffany said, her voice sharp, though she tried to coat it with a thin layer of sweetness. "What a surprise. I wasn't aware you were involved in family financial matters." It was a deliberate jab, meant to remind Simone of her place as a distant, poorer relative. Simone was unfazed. She simply looked at Tiffany, her expression calm. "Hello, Tiffany. Evelyn asked me to be here." She offered no further explanation, which seemed to enrage Tiffany even more. Simone took a seat a few chairs down from me, a quiet, unassuming ally in the heart of the enemy's camp. Evelyn cleared her throat, taking control of the room. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice commanding attention. She picked up a thick document bound in a blue folder. "This is the last will and testament of Beatrice Williams, signed and witnessed on June 12th, 2 years ago. I will now proceed with the reading." She began by reading the standard legal language, confirming that Beatrice was of sound mind and not under any duress when she wrote the will. She read a clause leaving Beatrice's collection of classic literature to the local public library. She read another, leaving a small sum of money to a distant cousin in another state. I could see Andre and Tiffany exchanging impatient glances. This was the sentimental nonsense they had been expecting. Then Evelyn reached the main section. Her voice became very clear, very deliberate. "Regarding the primary assets of the estate, including the family home located at 124 Willow Creek Lane, and all financial accounts, stocks, and bonds held within the Williams Family Trust, it is my will that these assets be bequeathed to my son, my only child, Andre Williams." As those words were spoken, I watched the last bit of tension drain from my son's shoulders. Tiffany's lips curled into a small, self-satisfied smile, and she subtly placed her hand on Andre's arm, a gesture of ownership. Andre sat up straighter in his chair, a look of absolute vindication on his face. He had done it. He had won. He even risked a quick glance in my direction, his eyes filled not with malice, but with something worse, pity. Pity for the old man he had so thoroughly outmaneuvered. He thought he had heard the end of the story. He thought the rest was just legal boilerplate. He relaxed back into his expensive leather chair, completely at ease, completely unprepared for what was coming next. Evelyn paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. She took a slow, deliberate sip of water from the glass in front of her. She placed the glass down with a soft click, then looked directly at Andre, her eyes as sharp as fragments of steel. "However," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "this inheritance is subject to certain conditions." The single word hung in the cold, sterile air of the conference room. However, it was a word Andre and Tiffany had not expected. They had been leaning back in their chairs, basking in the glow of their inheritance, but now a subtle tension returned. Andre's relaxed posture tightened. Tiffany's self-satisfied smile faltered, replaced by a look of mild irritation. They thought this was just a sentimental footnote, a mother's final unnecessary piece of advice. They had no idea it was the trigger for the entire trap. Evelyn looked from the will, her eyes meeting Andre's directly. Her voice, when she continued, was not the voice of a friendly family lawyer. It was the voice of a judge delivering a sentence. This inheritance, she repeated, her voice slow and deliberate, each word a carefully placed stone, is subject to certain conditions. I will now read the relevant clause written by Beatrice herself. She adjusted her glasses and read, "My greatest wish is for my beloved husband Theodore to live out the remainder of his days in the comfort and dignity he so richly deserves. I have left my estate to my son Andre, not merely as a gift but as a sacred trust. Therefore, this inheritance is entirely conditional upon his fulfillment of that trust. To receive any assets from my estate, my son Andre Williams must demonstrate unwavering care, respect, and familial duty towards his father for a period of 6 months following my passing. This is not a request, it is a test of his character." A nervous laugh escaped Tiffany's lips. "A character test? What is this, high school?" Andre just shook his head, looking at Evelyn as if she were a doddering old fool. "Evelyn, with all due respect, that's an unenforceable clause. It's completely subjective. Who determines if I've passed this test?" Evelyn's face remained impassive. She simply continued to read from the will. "Any action taken by my son that seeks to remove his father from the family home, to diminish his honor, to seize control of his assets under false pretenses, or to question his competency for personal gain, will constitute an immediate and irrevocable failure of this test. The determination of this failure shall be at the sole discretion of my executor in consultation with a witness of my choosing." Andre's face was turning pale. "A witness? What witness?" Before Evelyn could answer, he turned on me, his voice rising. "This is your doing, isn't it? You manipulated her. My mother would never—" His voice trailed off as Evelyn slowly, deliberately placed a stack of documents in the center of the vast mahogany table. "Beatrice was a meticulous woman, Andre," Evelyn said, her voice now as cold as ice. "And she asked me to be equally meticulous. You asked who determines your failure. Let's review the evidence." She picked up the first document. "Regarding the condition of respecting your father's home and dignity," she said, sliding a notarized affidavit across the table. "This is a statement from the locksmith you hired to change the locks on the family home, dated the day after your mother's funeral." Tiffany gasped. Andre stared at the paper as if it were a snake. Evelyn continued her rhythm, methodical, relentless. "Regarding the condition of honoring your mother's memory," she said, placing a series of glossy photographs on top of the affidavit. They were pictures of the black garbage bag sitting on the curb. One photo was a close-up, and my Beatrice's blue shawl was clearly visible through the plastic. These were taken by Simone, who was so disturbed by what she saw that she documented it. Tiffany shot a look of pure venom at Simone, who simply met her gaze without flinching. "Regarding the condition of providing for your father's care," Evelyn went on, her voice dropping. She slid a certified copy of the bank statement into the center of the pile. The $50,000 withdrawal was highlighted in yellow. "And this," she said, adding the printouts of Tiffany's social media posts, "is where the money for your father's health care actually went. A down payment on a new Lincoln Navigator and a first-class vacation to the Bahamas." The color drained completely from Tiffany's face. She looked like she was going to be sick. Andre was speechless, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. But Evelyn wasn't finished. "And finally," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of a guillotine's blade, "regarding the condition that forbids any attempt to question your father's competency for personal gain." She took one final document from her folder, a certified copy of the petition for conservatorship he had filed against me. She placed it on the very top of the pile. "I believe this document Andre filed under your name is the very definition of a catastrophic failure of your mother's test. The prosecution rests." The dam of their composure finally broke. "This is a joke. It's a setup." Tiffany shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. She shot up from her chair, pointing a trembling finger at Evelyn, then at me, then at Simone. "This is illegal. You can't do this. He is incompetent. We were trying to help him." Andre, for his part, seemed to have shrunk into his expensive suit. He was white as a sheet, his eyes wide with the horror of total comprehension. He looked at the mountain of evidence, at the legal trap his own mother had laid for him, and he finally understood. "My mother," he stammered, his voice a pathetic whisper. She wasn't thinking clearly. She was sick when she wrote this. This can't be valid." He was trying to declare his dead mother incompetent to save his own skin. It was his lowest moment. Evelyn let his pathetic words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final crushing blow. "On the contrary, Andre, your mother was never more clear in her life." She turned to the last page of the will, which brings me to the final clause. "In the event of Andre Williams's failure to meet the conditions of this test, it is my will that all primary assets of the estate, including the family home and the entirety of the Williams Family Trust, shall bypass him completely." Evelyn paused, looking at each of them in turn, letting the weight of their failure settle upon them. Then she finished. "And shall be transferred in their entirety to the secondary beneficiary, my beloved niece, Simone Williams, who has always shown the kindness, empathy, and integrity I had so hoped to see in my own son." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a world ending. Then came the sound. A raw, guttural sob tore from Tiffany's throat. It was not a sound of grief. It was the sound of a dream of wealth and status dying a violent death. She collapsed back into her chair, her face a grotesque mask of rage and despair. Andre just sat there, utterly broken. He stared at the documents on the table, the evidence of his own greed, the tools of his own destruction. He looked like a man who had been struck by lightning. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, now a hollowed-out man destroyed by his own choices, and I felt no triumph, only a profound, aching sadness. And in that same moment, I felt a wave of love and gratitude for my Beatrice, the brilliant, loving woman who had reached from beyond the grave to protect the man she loved. The test was over, and justice in its own sad and terrible way had been served. The chaotic aftermath of Evelyn's revelation was immediate and ugly. Tiffany's shock curdled into pure, undiluted rage. "No!" she shrieked, her voice cracking the tomb-like silence of the room. She lunged forward, her manicured nails pointing accusingly at Evelyn. "You can't do this. This is a trick. She was a sick old woman, and you people—" She spat, her wild eyes darting from Evelyn to me, then finally landing on Simone with burning hatred. "You poisoned her mind against her own son." Andre, meanwhile, was a broken man. The fight had completely drained out of him. He just stared at the pile of documents, the physical evidence of his downfall, and mumbled, No, Mom wouldn't. She loved me." He looked up at Evelyn, his eyes pleading, desperate for a lifeline. "This has to be a mistake, Evelyn. There has to be a way to contest this. The temporary conservatorship. The court agreed he wasn't competent. That has to count for something, right?" He was grasping at straws, but Evelyn Reed was a woman who dealt in pillars of granite. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were the final hammer blows shattering their last desperate hopes. "Contested on what grounds, Andre?" she asked, her voice calm and lethally precise. "That your mother accurately predicted your behavior. The will is ironclad. It was reviewed by 2 independent psychiatrists at the time of its signing to ensure there could be no question of her competency. Your mother was a brilliant woman, and she was always 2 steps ahead." She then turned her gaze to Tiffany, whose tirade had dissolved into choked sobs. "As for you, Mrs. Williams, I would advise you to be very careful about making baseless accusations of undue influence. Every action taken was documented, legally sound, and executed according to Mrs. Williams' explicit written instructions." Evelyn then delivered the final inescapable truth. "The temporary conservatorship, Andre, is now your biggest liability. By filing it, you legally entered into the court record under oath that you believed your father was incompetent for the purpose of controlling his assets. You did the one thing the will expressly forbade. You not only failed the test, you provided sworn legal testimony of your failure. It's over." With that, she closed the blue folder containing the will. The soft click of the cover echoed in the room like a cell door slamming shut. It was a sound of absolute finality. All their schemes, all their lies, all their greed had led them to this single, irrevocable moment of ruin. Their world had not just collapsed. It had been dismantled piece by piece by the very woman they thought they had silenced forever. I never asked about them. In the weeks that followed the reading of the will, I did not seek out news of Andre or Tiffany. There was no joy to be found in their ruin, only a deep and profound sadness. But news, like water, has a way of finding its own level. It came to me one Sunday afternoon, brought by Simone. She had come over to help me in the garden, and we were sitting on the porch sipping iced tea, the scent of Beatrice's roses hanging in the warm air. Simone was quiet for a long moment before she spoke, her voice gentle. "I saw them, Uncle Theo," she said softly. "I didn't mean to. I was visiting a patient who lives in the Northgate apartment complex, and I saw them in the parking lot." She described a scene that was a world away from the mahogany conference room. They were in the dingy parking lot of a cheap, run-down apartment building, the kind with peeling paint and rusting balconies. They were standing by the trunk of their old sedan. The new SUV, of course, had been repossessed. They were arguing, their voices sharp and ugly, echoing in the concrete space. Tiffany stripped of her designer clothes, and her confidence looked thin and worn. "This is all your fault," she had screamed at Andre, her voice raw. "Your crazy mother and her stupid test. You told me this was a sure thing. You were supposed to have everything under control." Andre, Simone said, looked like a ghost of the man he had been. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by wrinkled clothes. He looked tired and defeated. "My fault," he had yelled back, his voice cracking with desperation. "You were the one who couldn't wait to spend the money. We need a bigger house, Andre. We deserve that new car, Andre. You pushed me every step of the way, and you were the one stupid enough to post it all over the internet for the world to see." Their fight was not about grief or betrayal. It was the bitter accounting of two bankrupt souls, each blaming the other for a future that had been stolen, a future they now realized was built on nothing more than greed. Their partnership, I understood, had been a business transaction. And with the assets liquidated, there was nothing left but the debt of their own character. I listened to Simone's story and felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only a hollow ache for the son I had lost and the empty, broken man he had become. They had not just lost a house and an inheritance, they had lost themselves, and that was a tragedy far greater than any financial ruin. A week later, I stood on my own porch again. In my hand was a new key, a simple brass key that Simone had given me. It felt solid and real. I slid it into the lock, the new lock that Evelyn had arranged for replacing the cold alien one Andre had installed. The key turned smoothly, the click of the latch releasing a sound of welcome, a sound of belonging. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was no longer silent. A soft, warm light filled the hallway, and the air, which had been so stale and full of sorrow, now smelled faintly of lemon and baking bread. It smelled like home again. I walked into the living room, and what I saw made me stop in my tracks, my heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. Everything was back. The small, silver-framed photographs were arranged neatly on the mantelpiece again, polished to a shine. The picture of our wedding day, the one of Andre's graduation, they were all there, silent witnesses, restored to their rightful places. Over the back of Beatrice's favorite reading chair, the one by the window, her blue wool shawl was carefully draped as if she had just placed it there before stepping into the other room. Her half-read novel was on the small table beside it, the bookmark still holding her place. Simone had done more than just retrieve the items from those horrible black bags. She had rescued them. She had taken the time to clean away the filth of the garbage, to polish the silver, to restore each memory to its place of honor. It was an act of such profound love and respect that it stood in stark contrast to the brutal, thoughtless cruelty of my son. He and his wife had tried to erase Beatrice, to dispose of her life as if it were meaningless clutter. But Simone, with her quiet, caring hands, had single-handedly undone their desecration. She had pieced the soul of our home back together. I found her in the kitchen, humming softly to the radio as she pulled a loaf of banana bread from the oven, the very recipe Beatrice had taught her years ago. She saw me standing there and smiled her warm, genuine smile. I didn't have the words. I just looked at her, my eyes filled with a gratitude that was too deep to speak. She seemed to understand. "It's where they belong, Uncle Theo," she said softly. "Aunt Bee's things should be at home." Looking around the room at the life and warmth that had been breathed back into it, I knew she was right. This was not just a house. It was a sanctuary, a library of memories, and it was finally, truly, home again. A few weeks have passed since that day in the lawyer's office. I am home. I am free. I find myself standing by the living room window, often looking out at the garden Beatrice and I planted together. The roses are in full bloom. For a long time, I thought a man's legacy was the wealth and property he passed down, a foundation for the next generation. I see now that I was wrong. A true legacy isn't something you can write in a will. It is the values you live by, the love you give, and the integrity you maintain even when it is tested. Beatrice understood that. Her final act wasn't one of revenge against her son. I believe it was a final, desperate act of love. She gave him a choice, a clear and simple path to prove he was the man she had raised him to be. He failed not because of her will, but because of the choices he had already made long before she wrote it. There is a deep sadness in that knowledge, a grief for the son I lost. But there is no bitterness. There is only peace. The silence in the house is different now. It is not the heavy, empty silence of loss. It is a soft, comfortable quiet. The quiet of a home at peace. From the kitchen, I can hear the gentle clink of ceramic as Simone pours us both a cup of tea. The warm afternoon light streams in, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. I turn from the window and walk towards the kitchen, towards the sound of life, towards the future. We don't speak much, Simone and I. We don't need to. We sit at the familiar old kitchen table, the one that has witnessed a lifetime of joys and sorrows, and we drink our tea. It is in this simple, quiet moment that I find the greatest inheritance of all. Not a house, not a bank account, but the profound, unshakable peace that comes from knowing you are safe, you are respected, and you are loved. And that is a treasure no one can ever take away. This whole experience taught me a powerful lesson. True inheritance isn't found in a bank account or a property deed. It's found in the legacy of love, respect, and integrity you build over a lifetime. My wife Beatrice knew that character could not be bought or gifted, it had to be earned. Her final plan wasn't about revenge. It was a painful, necessary lesson in the true meaning of wealth. It proved that dignity is a fortress, and that sometimes the quietest plans are the ones that create the most profound justice in the end. For more stories about life, legacy, and justice, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's next.